Welcome to Philosophy 150. This is our Introduction to Ethics class. Good morning. Welcome to Philosophy 150, Introduction to Ethics. Good morning. Welcome to Philosophy 150. That's Introduction to Ethics. I'm Brian Boley. I'm your professor for this class. There are three parts to this initial lecture, this PowerPoint. This is now part one of three. We'll be talking about what is ethics. Ethics is a branch of philosophy that focuses upon what are the proper actions that we should take in our lives. Unlike other branches of philosophy, which are very thought-oriented and imaginary and based upon, if you will, building imaginary castles in the sky, ethics is action-oriented. It's very practical. What is the right thing to do? What's good? What's bad? And which course of action is going to result in good things instead of bad things? And furthermore, how do we determine what is good and what is bad? Of course, you may want to know what philosophy is. Well, philosophy comes from a Greek word, philo, which you may know as brotherly love, the root of Philadelphia, and Sophie, which is wisdom. So philosophy is the love of wisdom. Now, most of Western philosophy was started by a man named Plato, who lived back in ancient Greece around 500 BC. Plato was a student of Socrates, who didn't write anything, but Plato wrote down what Socrates said. And then Plato's best student was a man named Aristotle, and we'll talk a lot about Aristotle in this class. Aristotle became famous largely because he was the tutor of Alexander the Great, the man who conquered much of the Middle East. Well, philosophy overall is largely a mental discussion and debate about topics like reality, how do we know things, knowledge, and what is a good life and how to live it. Now, philosophy has certain subdisciplines. Some of these are logic, which is how do we prove ideas are true or false. Axiology, which is a study of values, and we'll talk a little bit about axiology and logic in this course. Metaphysics, literally beyond the physics, is what do we think about the universe and how it's constructed. Theology is the study of God. Linguistics, the study of language. There's political and social philosophy, which is the study of governments and societies. Rhetoric, which we will talk about later today, is a study of the art of persuasion. There's aesthetics, which is the study of beauty, what's beautiful and what's not beautiful. Ontology is the study of existence. Epistemology is how do we know things. And of course, we know about science, the study of the world and the universe. Game theory is a relatively recent area in philosophy, which is the study of decision making. And then something we'll cover a lot in the later part of the course, deontology, the study of duty. Ethics, well, that's our main discipline here. What's the right course of action? Now, I'm assuming that you're like most people. You want to follow an ethical life. You want to do good. You don't want to do evil. But there are some key questions here. And what I want you to do is stop this PowerPoint as soon as I finish this slide and go to the discussion board. The first question is, can you do good all by yourself? Can you do good and not evil? How do you, what keeps you from doing this by yourself? What do you need to do to make sure that you can do this? It's a complicated question, and I'd like a little bit of discussion. Make sure you give good responses to other people on the online forum. Remember to create thread to start your own thread of discussion. Make a solid posting, and then answer and respond to at least 3 other people. Now we move to part 2 of our 3 parts. Today, we're going to be talking about how to argue our points. Okay, now we're going to move on to part 2 of 3, the 3 parts today. This section is going to be talking about how to argue our points. In this section, we're going to talk about several ways that we can persuade others to a point of view and go through the advantages and disadvantages of each one. When we want to change someone's opinion, there are 3 basic ways that we can do this. The traditional way, the oldest way, the way of the savage, is physical coercion. This is where you simply come up and say, if you don't change your mind, if you do not do what I want, I'm going to beat you to a pulp. Of course, this can occur through threats, or actually someone can actually take a hold of someone and force them to do something. Physical coercion, as you may have gathered, has gone out of style. It is not generally considered an ethical way to encourage someone to agree with us. The second way are economic incentives. These fall under 2 basic categories: bribes and blackmail. A bribe being some sort of economic incentive, money or gifts given to someone to encourage them to do what you want them to do. Blackmail is where you ask for someone to give you economic incentives, money or gifts, to keep you from doing something that would harm them. All of these are considered not very ethical, and they're not generally legal in our system. Rhetoric, though, is the way that we use. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, the art of convincing someone through speech or written words to do what you want them to do. We're going to cover this in a bit of depth. The reason we get involved in rhetoric and such, and persuasion, is ethics is more than my personal idea of what's right versus wrong. In most real-life ethical situations, I'm not the only actor. Instead, I have to persuade you, or you have to persuade me, to do some sort of action. And that means we have to learn how to persuade. We rarely have the ability or the desire to coerce or bribe or blackmail people, so we have to use rhetoric to accomplish our ethical goals. We have to use our speech or our written word. Ethics, we get involved in all these ethical discussions, and ethics is more than what my personal idea of right and wrong is. Ethics almost always requires action of more than one person. So most real-life ethical issues require me to persuade you, or you to persuade me, of a course of action. Now, we rarely have the ability to coerce or bribe or blackmail someone into doing what we want them to do. So we have to use rhetoric, the art of speaking and writing well, to accomplish the ethical goals that we've set for ourselves. Let me give you an example. In your job, let's say you're in the criminal justice world. You and some other members of the officer corps are discussing a course of action toward, let's just say, a drug dealer. There are certain ways that you can go about arresting him, some of which are considered ethical and some of which are not. Discussing this and determining what are the bounds on what you're able to do to bring this guy to justice requires that discussion, and it requires persuasion of other people who may have different ideas. In the healthcare industry, there are decisions that have to be made often about how much treatment someone gets, whether somebody gets a particular drug or not, which of two people get a drug that's in tight supply, who gets the open ventilator and who does not. We have to make these decisions, and we rarely get to make them completely by ourselves. Instead, it's a group decision. So we have to use rhetoric to accomplish the ethical process and come up with what is the right course of action. Now, in an ideal world, people would look at us and only consider our ideas. If our ideas are good, they'd accept them. If their ideas are poor, they'd not accept them. Everyone wants the most ethical course of action. At least in an ideal world, that's what happens. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in the real world. So is it likely that only our ideas are going to be considered and that everyone wants the most ethical course of action in the real world? How is the real world different from the ideal world? Now, what I'd like you to do now is I want you to stop and go to the real world discussion forum and, again, give a good post answering these questions as you see them, and then respond to at least 3 other people's posts with some substantial. Feel free, by the way, to get into a back and forth discussion on things, but remember to remain respectful. Now we'll begin part 3 of 3, where we're going to talk more detailed about some of the processes and some of the terminology of rhetoric. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, who lived between 384 and 322 BC, wrote an extended discussion about rhetoric. Rhetoric was the art of persuasion. Speaking in the Athenian assembly, someone who had excellent rhetoric could sway the crowd. And so Aristotle essentially gave us a textbook on rhetoric. There are 3 major sections to rhetoric that Aristotle pointed out. The first one is ethos, the credibility of the person speaking. The second is logos, the logical reasoning developed in that speech. And the third one is pathos, which is an emotional kicker which is put into the speech that brings it around and gives it warmth and passion. In our speaking, and indeed in our writing, our ethos is important. Our personal credibility is very important when we speak to an audience. Imagine the difference between a lightweight, giggly teenage boy speaking to an audience and an accomplished adult with a strong reputation, who's wearing a dark blue suit, who has gray hair, and whom we know has lived in the area of expertise that the speech is about. There's a real difference in their impact. What we need to consider is why we are credible to an audience. In the first case, it's our appearance and our dress. Are we well groomed? Or do we look like a wild person, like one of the pictures of John the Baptist, for example, with our hair all over the place, wearing camel hair outfit, being dirty? It makes a difference when we compare that to, for example, a well-dressed person who is wearing a powerful business suit. It does make a real difference. The man with the white coat, who we know is the doctor, is more credible on most things than the uh, person who is a nursing assistant dressed in a candy striper outfit. When it comes to answering the question of what should we do in this case, we'll defer to the doctor largely because of the way they look and dress. The second thing are the racial and ethnic, the gender, the age, the other personal characteristics of the person speaking. Let's be honest, in some venues, white people are considered to be more credible, and in other venues, white people are considered to be less credible. It depends on what's being spoken about. In some areas, women are considered more credible. In other areas, men are considered more credible. Our age makes a difference. In general, for most academic subjects, someone with some age is considered more credible than someone who is young. However, for other issues, such as, let's say, a discussion of popular trends of the day, someone who is in their 20s will be considered more credible than someone who looks like me with gray to white hair. Gravitas. Gravitas is the demeanor of the person. Someone who has gravitas is seen as a serious individual, as opposed to someone who's laughing and giggling and making jokes all the time. Gravitas conveys a sense of seriousness and, generally speaking, gives us more credibility. Our manner of speech or writing makes a tremendous difference. There is, after all, proper English. There are ways that we speak, there's grammar that we use, there are words that we don't use. I once had a person point out to another person, no one ever hired John because they said, I want to hire John because he cusses better than anybody else. However, there's been many cases where John was not hired because he cussed a lot. Our manner of speech, our accent. As West Virginians, mostly, we know how people will make fun of our accents. And there are just certain accents that convey seriousness better than others. It all depends upon who we're talking to and what we're talking about. And then there's our reputation. If everyone knows, for example, that we have been the chief of police of a major city police department that's known for being a safe city, and we've been that chief of police for the past 15 years, people in the criminal justice industry will listen to us much more than if our reputation is being chief of police of a city that's known for being out of control. In the same way, in the medical field, a doctor who we know has graduated from Johns Hopkins, has spent time at the Mayo Clinic, and now has come to town to teach us on his area or her area of expertise, we will listen more to them than someone who is an intern just out of Marshall Med School. So the question is, are you a credible speaker on the ethical subject that's coming up? Logos, which is Greek for the Greek word behind logic and also the active word, means what is the logical progression of your argument? Does A cause B and B cause C, and therefore you can conclude that if we do A, it will eventually cause C? Our arguments must be logical. They must make sense. We must argue from facts, not feelings or traditions or hopes. That does not fall under logos. That falls under pathos. The logic must feel right to the audience, and it must be tight. There must not be any holes. There's an engineer sitting out there or an analytical doctor who's sitting out there who's trying to find the holes in what you're saying. These are your detailed logical thinkers, and they will find holes in your logic if there is a hole there. That logic has to make sense. And making sense is largely based upon the previous experiences and worldview of the audience. If, for example, you're presenting a medical idea about, for example, some vaccines to a group of people, perhaps in another country, who have never heard of vaccines before, but who have instead indulged in magical thinking about the causes of disease, you're going to have to think very carefully about your logical progression, because they will not understand at all the idea of giving somebody a bit of disease in order to cure a big disease. In fact, we're seeing that right now in the US with the anti-vaccine movement. We see this with things in the criminal justice. Does it make sense to help a homeless person? Or does it make sense to encourage him to leave town? This is based upon the previous worldview of the audience. What has been their experience? Logic has to take people from where they are to where you want them to go. Every argument needs to have a logical progression. One of the things about ethical arguments is they're not abstract. Whenever we get into an agreement, one of the things about ethical arguments is that they really aren't abstract ideas about what's right and wrong. There are always real people involved. And in the real world, the logos, the logical argument, isn't usually enough to be persuasive. In general, we can work through our logic, but we have to remember that real people are involved. And therefore, for an argument to be persuasive, we have to deal with the humanity of the people involved. And that requires an emotional appeal, what we call pathos, what Aristotle called pathos. Pathos is that part of the argument that pulls at the heartstrings. It's the reminder that people are involved, not these abstract entities, not cartoon characters, but real people. Why do we consider that, for example, abortion might be wrong or right? We always need to talk about the potential death of a child or the potential trouble that a young mother might run into when she's not prepared to have a child. These arguments that are pulled out to pull at our heartstrings are pathos. Now, the three areas, ethos, logos, and pathos, cannot stand alone. They are all interconnected in virtually every argument we ever make. People think often that they went to a particular decision because of the logic involved, the logos. But usually what's happened is people have come to an emotional decision and they want logic which allows them to justify their pathos. They want emotion. They want the emotional reason for justification. They start with the emotion. Let's start that again. We have to remember that our ethos, our logos, and our pathos cannot stand alone. Virtually every argument that we make involves elements of all three. Now, people usually come to a decision based upon their emotions, and then they work back and they use the logos, the logic, to justify what they emotionally want to do. But yet, their emotions can't stand alone. The argument is very weak if we rely on, I don't feel like this is the right answer, or I feel that this is the right answer. That's not strong enough for people because most people understand there has to be some logic involved. Yet, logos cannot stand alone. You can't just use a logical argument and expect to win the argument in the real world because people are involved, real people. It's not a chess game. It's not a matter of make this move and then that move and we win. No, there are real people who will win and who will lose on virtually every ethical discussion that we have. Now, ethos, our personal credibility, in some cases, if it's strong enough, many people will be convinced of the rightness of the argument simply because of who said it. We see this a lot in politics. One politician who is very popular will convince many people that a certain path is right or wrong simply because that politician said so. But yet people on the other side will not be interested because, again, that particular politician said so. Therefore, they feel that the argument must be wrong. Ethos is strong and can convince many, but it's not enough to stand alone in real world situations. So if you have a severe weakness in any of these three, the ethos, who is, in other words, who is presenting the argument, the logos, the logical argument itself, and the pathos, the emotional kicker. If you have a severe weakness in any of those three, your argument will be sunk. It will not accomplish the persuasive goal. However, you will need to be strong in all three to convince most everybody. There's a practical outcome to all this discussion. The moral of the story is you need today to begin your reputation, to begin building your reputation for credibility. Your ethos with your peers, with your employer, with the people outside your employment is going to be important. That's why it's important that a police officer be seen as a fine, moral, upstanding member of the community. Because one day he's going to say, you need to do this, and he needs people to follow his lead. This is why people in the medical profession need to have high, upstanding reputations. Because when the nurse says we need to do this, or the doctor says we need to do this, people need to react and do it. So one day you hope to be in one of these positions, and you need to have that reputation for credibility, your reputation for having the right answer and the moral and ethical answers if you wish to have a strong presence in your profession. So begin today building your reputation for credibility. Work on your appearance, work on your soberness, work on all those issues that were shown back on a previous slide. Here are some ideas of how you can build your ethos. Remember, ethos is the trust that you have, your personal credibility, which is built among your listeners and the people you're trying to persuade through your appearance and your actions, your reputation, your speech, and your writing. So here's a few things that might help you with this. First of all, develop a reputation that you keep promises. Always be a good friend. Whenever you work, you're not going to work by yourself. You're going to have friends and you're going to have people that you work with. Keep the promises you make to them. Be a good friend. Keep promises to the community around, to your patients. Keep promises to any of the criminal element if you happen to be in criminal justice. Be a good friend. Always support and affirm others. You know, if you gossip about people, most people intuitively know that if you gossip about Mary Ann, then you will probably gossip about the listener. So don't gossip. Help and develop your followers. There are people who are already on your side. Help them out. Develop them. Help them learn and become strong members of your team. Don't tear them down. Get the answers right. Make sure that when you have the answers, they are right, but that's not always going to happen. So apologize quickly when you do mess up. Be humble. Now, being humble doesn't mean dropping your head all the time. No, it means that you're willing to learn from others, that you seek out the wisest people around you and you learn from them. Now, when you do something that hurts somebody, or more importantly, when they do something that hurts you, forgive quickly. Don't hold on to grudges. Most people injure others unintentionally, so forgive them quickly and don't hold on to grudges. Grudges will develop enemies. Always strive to learn more and be better at your job. Be a better person. Try to be the smartest and best person around, but don't come across as a know-it-all. Now work on your appearance. Every profession has certain standards of appearance. For example, a patrol officer has a uniform. Make sure your uniform is kept in good shape. A nurse has a particular uniform. Make sure that your uniform is kept in good shape and also look the way you're supposed to look. If, for example, you're a patrol officer, most people expect a patrol officer to have short, neat hair. Don't wear a ponytail as a patrol officer. It's not the part. That says that you're a rebel to most people, particularly older folk. There's an old saying, let no foolish talk come from your lips. When you speak, make sure you have something to say. Don't just laugh and giggle and act lightweight. Instead, be a sober person. Be the moral person. That doesn't mean you can't joke around, but make sure that you don't go over the top that way. Don't go too far. Something I learned from an old guy, he was a bank president and he was on the board of a company I worked for. John always let everyone else speak first. He wasn't the president of the company, but he let everyone else speak first. And then just before it went to the decision maker, the president of the company, then John would speak. He would he would speak and consider what had been said by everyone else in the room first. And then he'd say, and therefore I think we ought to do this. He listened. Letting others speak first is the best way to learn. Now, another thing related to this is don't do crazy. There are people who delight in doing crazy. Don't do that. You lose your credibility. So just don't do crazy. Don't get pulled over for a DUI. Don't get pulled over for drugs, whatever. Just stay sober, and you will develop your personal reputation for solidness and credibility. Now, if you do this right, you're going to win many arguments. Be a good sport, particularly when you win. Always be nice to the person you've defeated. Be very kind to them. You want to try to convert your enemies instead of defeating them. Persuasion is not about driving someone into the dust. Persuasion, rhetoric, is about bringing people over to your side. You know, if you defeat someone, then they've got one less person on their side. But if you convert them to you, they've got one less person and you've got one more person. It's always much better to try to convert your enemies than defeat your enemies. And that means you must be very magnanimous, very much a good sport when you are victorious in an argument. Now, sometimes we're not arguing for a particular ethical stand, but we know we want to argue against a particular ethical argument. Here's a few tips on how to argue against something. A strong way to do this is to show the logic is false. Argue against the logos. Just say that logical statement just doesn't make sense. You can also be very strong if you can show that their logic would lead to absurd results. If you do this and this and this and this, well, then we would end up with hundreds of people dying. And that's the logical outcome of your argument. That's not something we want to do. So show that the logic would lead to absurd results. You can also show that the argument relies too much upon emotion, too much pathos. Many people do not like being manipulated by emotional feelings. But many times nobody calls out the fact that this is almost purely an emotional argument. If you show that this is emotion and the logic takes us somewhere else, then you will be able to argue against that particular bad ethical idea. You can also show that the facts, the premises that the person is arguing from, are incorrect. For example, someone might say that we have a terrible homeless problem in Parkersburg, that the number of homeless people is increasing rapidly. Well, you might want to actually go get some real facts, and you might find out that the number of homeless is decreasing. For example, one of the things that we have noticed recently is that the number of overdose deaths in West Virginia has been decreasing rapidly. If you argue that the overdoses are increasing, which many people will still do, well, that's based upon old facts. The new facts show just the opposite. Now, you can also counter with superior logic. You can take their series of arguments and show that if you did things just a little different, you would end up with a better solution. Now, a lot of times people try to counter an argument with a superior emotional appeal. It's been my experience that this tends to be a fairly weak way to attack an argument because all we're doing is arguing, is it better, for example, for um, is it better to pursue a course of action that will kill children, or is it better to pursue a course of action that will kill infants? Well, all those are emotional arguments either way, and therefore attacking with trying to pull at the heartstrings more tends to be a weaker way to destroy an argument. Now, you can also try to overwhelm someone with superior ethos, which is kind of the person standing up in front and saying, well, my resume is much stronger than your resume. I've been in this industry for 30 years and you've been in it for 2 years. How dare you contradict me? My credibility is much better than yours. Well, that's generally speaking a pretty weak argument because people often do not like people who boast about their credibility. It's kind of interesting. Ethos, if you boast about it, you lose it. If you don't boast about it, but just let it flow out, you gain ethos. And therefore, people who are humble and just let the facts be known about who they are usually win the argument over people who boast about how good they are and how they have superior knowledge. I'm going to change up just a little bit here. This is again from the textbook. There are two major branches of ethics that we're going to study. One part is what we refer to as meta-ethics, where we ask such questions as, what does good mean? How do we know when something is good? Is it possible to find an ethical truth, or are all truths relative? How do we determine, what method do we use to determine a good path as opposed to a bad path? These are questions that meta-ethics discuss. These are very high-level, abstract questions that we can apply in almost all circumstances, trying to figure out these very high-level questions. Then we have the branch we call normative ethics, where meta-ethics asks, what does good mean? Normative ethics asks, what is good in this situation? What is our good goal? What is an evil goal? What is bad? Normative ethics asks, what should we do in these situations? It asks, what's a virtue? What's a vice? How do we determine the difference? And what rights do we have? What rights should we have? And then we get into a subcategory of normative ethics called applied normative ethics. And that is where we ask, in this particular situation, this particular case, what should we do? What is the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do? So this is something that you will probably find on a quiz, is understanding the difference between meta-ethics and normative ethics, between normative ethics and applied normative ethics. Normative ethics is more in general, what is good and what should we do, and applied means what about the specific situation. And so we come now to, why do we study ethics? Well, for most of you, it's a required class. You may want to think about why such areas as healthcare, criminal justice require the study of ethics. Now we come to the question of why study ethics. Well, for most of you, it's required for your major. But you might want to consider why criminal justice and medical fields require a study of ethics. Well, a large part of it is these two professions in particular are constantly having to make ethical decisions about what is right, what is wrong, how can we proceed, what will give the best outcome, what is not a good way to proceed, and what's not a good outcome. In general, we need more ethics in our society. Without ethical decision making, our society would fall apart. These questions continually come up in most professions, but also in most of our relationships, in raising our children, in our work. Ethical studies, at least as taught in this class, is going to sharpen your reasoning skills, which will help you in future career-oriented exams. And a continual ethical discussion improves the society around us. Being able to argue persuasively and reasonably and yet maintain friendships is something that is needed in our society to make it a better society. Years ago, I studied under Dr. Doug McIntosh. Doug had played basketball at UCLA in the late 1960s, back when Wooten was the coach, legendary Coach Wooten. Doug had been a pastor for 50 years. And one of the things he said that really struck to me was he said, I used to think philosophy was not important, but now I think philosophy is most important. How we approach life, the principles, the actions that we take in our life, that is what life is about. And in my years as pastor, I've concluded that the study of ethics builds character. Good character is what builds our influence in the world. And our influence is what changes the world. Not the things we do directly, but the influence we have on other people. This slide and the next one are to prepare you for next. This slide and the next one are to prepare you for the next module. Now here's the question I want you to answer. Are ethical discussions, ethical standards, are they based upon our culture, or are there absolute standards that apply across all cultures? Be sure to give evidence supporting your position and then reply to the postings of at least 3 other people. Go on after the next slide, go to the discussion forum labeled Culture or Absolutes. In our next module, we're going to be talking a lot about whether ethical standards are based upon culture or whether there are absolute standards. So I want you to read chapter 1, and also you can begin work on case 1. Case 1 is entitled, Whose Culture Triumphs?